Hello there, and welcome to The Sleepy Historian, a quiet corner where the past drifts in softly, and forgotten worlds return as gentle stories for the night. Tonight, we'll be wandering into strange medieval castle rules that could quietly shape your fate, along with the hidden journeys of the violin, the fading mystery of the Minoan world, and the brief yet luminous life of Mozart, letting old times unfold at a pace meant for rest. But before you settle in, if you truly enjoy these calm journeys through history, you're welcome to like this video and subscribe, only if it feels right for you. And when you're ready, let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It's always a quiet joy to see how many places and moments gather here together. Now, dim the lights, and maybe let a fan hum in the background, and let's slowly step into the past. Softly, gently, together. You approach the great hall slowly, not because the doorway is narrow, but because something about the space beyond it asks you to move carefully. The hall is large, though not empty. Smoke from the central hearth rises in a pale ribbon toward beams darkened by many winters. Long tables stretch across the room like quiet roads. Benches wait beside them, smooth from generations of sleeves brushing their edges. At first, it seems like an ordinary gathering place. Then you notice that no one is standing quite anywhere they please. A castle hall is not simply a room where people eat. It is a place where everyone can be seen. The chroniclers, such as Jean Froissart, described noble halls as spaces where rank became visible, even before a single word was spoken. The room itself helps arrange the order of the world. Near the far wall stands the high table, raised slightly above the others. It does not look dramatic. Just a little higher, just a little closer to the Lord's chair. But that small difference changes everything. Here, height is meaning, distance is meaning, even direction is meaning. You pause near the doorway, and already that pause is being noticed. In a medieval household, entering the hall was a little like stepping into a woven cloth where each thread already had its place. Move gently enough, and you become part of the pattern. Move carelessly, and the weave tightens around you. Not painfully, just unmistakably. Along one wall, a young servant is adjusting benches before supper begins. He works quietly, sliding them only a finger's width at a time. One bench shifts closer to the high table. Another moves slightly back. He checks the spacing with careful eyes, then steps away, then returns again to correct something almost invisible. He is not guessing. He is arranging rank. Household manuals and later historical studies tell us that seating inside great halls followed a structure understood by everyone present, even those who pretended not to notice it. To sit closer to the Lord meant recognition. To sit too far forward without invitation meant presumption, and presumption could travel farther than you intended. You remain standing a little longer than necessary, watching how others choose their places. Some move confidently, others hesitate, just slightly, as though listening for a signal no one else can hear. This hesitation is wisdom. Because inside a castle hall, mistakes were rarely treated as accidents. Actions were read as intentions. Sitting too high suggested ambition. Sitting too low suggested uncertainty. Remaining unsure for too long suggested that perhaps you did not belong at all. It is a demanding room. Fortunately, it is also a patient one. Servants pass between the tables with quiet certainty, carrying trenchers of bread and placing them in careful order. They rarely speak, yet they guide the entire arrangement. If someone drifts too close to the wrong place, a servant adjusts a cup, shifts a plate, or gestures softly toward another bench. Correction arrives without embarrassment, most of the time. You notice something else now. People are not only watching the Lord, they are watching each other. A glance travels across the hall like a ripple across still water. Someone pauses before sitting. Someone else shifts slightly to make space. Another lowers his voice, even though no one has asked him to. The room listens to itself. Historians such as Joseph and Francis Guise describe the Great Hall as the social center of castle life. But it is also something quieter than that. It is a place where identity becomes visible through small decisions. Where to stand, where to rest your hands, how quickly to sit after being invited, even how long to remain silent. You finally choose a place along one of the lower benches. Not too near, not too far. A safe distance where conversation can reach you without requiring you to begin it. This too is a skill. Because surviving inside a castle often means learning how to be present without becoming memorable. Noticeable enough to belong. Unremarkable enough to remain comfortable. A delicate balance, though perhaps easier than remembering which fork to use several centuries before forks become fashionable. As the benches fill and the last footsteps settle into stillness, something unexpected begins to take shape in the air. No one has spoken yet. And still, everyone is already communicating. You begin to understand that silence inside this hall is not empty at all. It is structured. It is watched. And it may be telling others more about you than any introduction ever could. Somewhere nearby, a servant adjusts a single bench once more, just slightly closer to the high table than before. You cannot help wondering what that small movement means. After a little while, the benches no longer seem like furniture. They begin to feel more like boundaries drawn without ink. You notice that people do not simply choose where to sit. They arrive already knowing where they belong. Some move directly to their places with the calm certainty of habit. Others pause just long enough to confirm that the space beside them is still permitted. No one explains this aloud, yet everyone understands it. Historians who study medieval households often describe the Great Hall as a carefully arranged landscape of rank, where distance from the Lord's chair reflected closeness to authority. It was not necessary for anyone to announce these rules. The benches themselves carried the message. And near the raised table at the front of the room stands a small object that looks almost decorative at first glance. A salt cellar. It rests between plates of polished metal and folded breadcloths, catching the glow of the firelight. But it is not simply a container for seasoning. In many noble households, the position of the salt marked a quiet boundary between those seated above it and those seated below it. To sit above the salt meant recognition. To sit below it meant respect. To cross that invisible line without invitation meant something else entirely. You begin to understand why people entered the hall so carefully. A kitchen boy passes beside you now, carrying wooden trenchers stacked neatly against his chest. He moves quickly, but not carelessly, stepping between benches as though following paths only he can see. Each trencher finds its place without hesitation. He has learned this map through repetition. Perhaps he does not know the names of the people who will sit here, but he knows where they belong. When he reaches the middle of the table, he pauses for the smallest moment. One trencher shifts slightly closer to the high end. Another remains where it is. The difference is no wider than your thumb. Yet it changes everything. Inside a castle hall, small distances speak loudly. You notice that the air itself seems to respond when someone chooses the wrong place. Conversation slows before it begins. A servant lingers nearby. Someone clears their throat gently, as if remembering something important that has not yet been said. No one points, no one corrects, and still the room adjusts. It feels a little like the moment before rain, or when the air grows heavier without becoming uncomfortable. Something is happening, though quietly enough that only careful listeners notice it. In medieval society, actions inside shared spaces were rarely treated as accidents. Sitting too near the high table could suggest ambition. Sitting too far away could suggest uncertainty. Remaining uncertain for too long could suggest unfamiliarity with the household itself. None of these conclusions were spoken aloud, but they were understood. A guest across the hall shifts slightly closer to the center of the bench. The movement is small, almost polite, yet a servant approaches almost immediately and places a cup beside him in a different position than before, guiding him gently back into alignment with the expected order. Correction arrives like a soft breeze rather than a command. You begin to see that servants are not only carrying food, they are carrying structure. Their quiet adjustments protect everyone from embarrassment, including the people they correct. This arrangement allows the hall to remain calm. It also allows hierarchy to remain visible without becoming loud. In studies of medieval households, historians often note that public order depended on shared understanding rather than constant instruction. People watched one another closely, not out of suspicion, but out of responsibility. If someone appeared uncertain, others helped restore balance before the mistake became noticeable. Because once a mistake became noticeable, it belonged to everyone. A noble who ignored a seating error risked appearing inattentive. A steward who failed to correct it risked appearing careless. Even nearby guests could be drawn into the uncertainty simply by sitting too close to the confusion. Rank was never entirely private. It traveled across the table like warmth from the hearth, touching more people than expected. The kitchen boy returns again, this time with a basket of bread. He pauses beside the salt cellar before placing the last piece. His hand hovers there for just a moment, as though confirming the boundary once more. He does not look at the Lord's chair. He does not need to. The hall has already told him everything. You rest your hands quietly against the edge of the bench, feeling the smoothness worn into the wood by generations before you. Many of them must have wondered the same thing you are wondering now. Not whether they were welcome, but whether they were placed correctly. Because inside this hall, belonging is measured not only by invitation, but by position. And even the smallest shift along the bench can change how others understand where you stand. After a while, the hall begins to fill with sound. Not quickly, not all at once. Instead, conversation unfolds slowly, like the careful movement of birds settling along a long winter fence, each one watching the others before choosing where to land. You notice that no one speaks immediately after sitting. Voices wait. Even laughter waits. The pause is not uncomfortable. It feels deliberate, almost respectful. In many medieval households, speech followed an order that was rarely written down, but widely understood. The Lord spoke first. Those nearest him answered. Others joined only when space opened naturally in the conversation. On no signal announced this structure. And yet, it held. You sit quietly, listening to the rhythm of voices rising and falling near the high table. The sound does not spread evenly through the hall. It travels outward in gentle layers, growing softer as it reaches the lower benches. Here, conversation feels different, more careful, more observant. A shared cup begins to move along your section of the table. It passes from one pair of hands to another, pausing briefly each time before continuing. No one rushes. No one interrupts the movement. Even this small object seems to follow the same invisible order as the voices around it. Historians who study medieval halls often note that speaking was not simply a matter of confidence. It was a matter of permission. Not always spoken permission, often something quieter. Permission felt through timing. A man 2 places away begins to speak before the Lord has finished addressing the table above him. The interruption is small, almost accidental. Yet the response arrives immediately. No one corrects him directly. Instead, conversation near him slows. Someone beside him lowers their voice. Another turns slightly away, continuing a different discussion. Within moments, the man stops speaking on his own. The hall has answered him. Inside a castle, silence could guide behavior as clearly as instruction. It allowed correction without embarrassment. It preserved dignity while restoring balance. You begin to understand why careful listening mattered so much. Across the room, a household scribe rises from a narrow bench beside the wall. He carries a folded piece of parchment in both hands, holding it gently as though it might shift if he moved too quickly. He does not begin reading immediately. Instead, he waits. The Lord finishes speaking. A steward nods once. Only then does the scribe open the parchment and begin to read aloud. His voice is steady, but quiet. He does not rush. Each word settles into the room as though it has been placed there carefully. When he finishes, he lowers his head slightly and returns to his seat without drawing attention to himself. His task is complete. Moments like this remind you that speech inside the hall is not casual conversation. It is part of the structure that keeps the household balanced. Words move upward toward authority and outward toward agreement, but rarely downward without invitation. Even questions follow this pattern. To ask too quickly could suggest impatience. To ask too directly could suggest uncertainty. To ask too boldly could suggest ambition. So people learn another skill instead. They learn how to wait. Ian Mortimer describes medieval social life as a world in which status shaped not only where people stood, but how they participated in conversation itself. Silence was not emptiness. It was awareness. You notice now how often people pause before speaking. They watch the direction of attention. They listen for the small opening that signals safety. It feels a little like watching a flock turn together in the sky, each bird responding to movements too subtle for any single observer to control. No one commands the change, and still it happens. The shared cup returns along the table and reaches your hands at last. Its surface is warm from many fingers. You hold it for a moment longer than necessary, not drinking immediately, simply feeling its weight. Even this pause becomes part of the conversation around you. Because here, everything is noticed. A guest farther down the bench leans forward to speak too soon again, this time with more confidence. A steward steps closer, placing a small dish before him that requires both hands to steady. The interruption is gentle, almost kind, but the meaning is clear. Wait a little longer. The guest nods quietly and falls silent. Correction has arrived without a word. Joseph and Francis Guise described the Great Hall as a place where authority remained visible through shared habits rather than constant commands. Order did not depend on punishment. It depended on recognition. Everyone understood the pattern, and everyone helped maintain it. You begin to feel something unexpected as the evening continues. Relief. Because once you learn how conversation moves in this room, you no longer need to guess. You only need to listen. The hall itself will tell you when to speak. Until then, silence keeps you safe. After listening for a while, you begin to notice something even quieter than speech. People are watching hands. At first, this seems unlikely. The hall is full enough already. Voices travel slowly between benches. Cups move from place to place. Servants step carefully between tables, carrying bread and warm dishes. There is already so much to observe. And yet, attention keeps returning to the smallest gestures. A man lifts his sleeve slightly before reaching across the table. Another rests both hands flat beside his trencher rather than touching it too soon. A third waits until the steward nods before adjusting his seat even by the smallest distance. No one explains these movements, but everyone understands them. Historians who study medieval household life often remind us that manners were not only about politeness, they were signals. They showed whether a person had grown up inside structured company or arrived there only recently. Hands revealed experience in ways that words could not. Across the table, you notice a shared knife resting between two diners. It lies there quietly, its handle worn smooth from long use. In many great halls, knives were not personal possessions brought to each seat. Instead, they were shared carefully among neighbors at the table. Sharing required attention, and it also required trust. You watch as one guest reaches for the knife, pauses, and then waits for the person beside him to finish before taking it. The delay is small, almost invisible, yet it carries meaning. It shows awareness of the other person's place. Awareness always mattered here. Nearby, an older steward moves along the length of the bench with unhurried steps. He pauses beside a visiting guest whose sleeve has slipped slightly too close to a serving bowl. Without speaking, the steward lifts the edge of the cloth and folds it back gently toward the guest's wrist. The correction is so soft that the guest almost does not notice, but everyone else does. Inside a medieval hall, gestures like this preserved harmony. They allowed mistakes to disappear before they became visible. Joseph and Francis Guise describe how experienced household officers often guided behavior in precisely this quiet way, protecting both the guest and the order of the room at the same time. Your own hands begin to feel heavier now that you are aware of them. Where should they rest? How quickly should they move? Even the act of reaching for bread seems to ask a question before it happens. You decide to wait a little longer before moving again. It feels safer. Across the hall, someone meets the Lord's gaze directly for just a moment too long. The look is not unfriendly. It is simply steady. Yet the response travels through the benches almost immediately. A nearby guest shifts slightly in his seat. Another lowers his eyes toward the table. The message is clear. Eye contact moves differently across ranks. To meet a lord's gaze briefly could show respect. To hold it too long could suggest challenge. So people learn to measure even their looking. Ian Mortimer describes medieval society as one in which confidence itself could sometimes appear suspicious if it arrived without the expected signs of humility. A person who moved too freely or too comfortably risked appearing uncertain of their position rather than secure within it. You begin to understand why stillness feels so powerful here. Stillness gives others time to understand you. Stillness prevents mistakes from forming too quickly. Stillness allows the room to continue breathing at its careful pace. The shared knife returns again to its resting place between two diners. This time, no one reaches for it immediately. Instead, both neighbors wait for a servant to pass nearby before continuing their meal. It is not hesitation. It is awareness. You notice now how often people move together without speaking. Cups are lifted almost at the same moment along one section of the bench. Sleeves are drawn back in quiet sequence. Even laughter begins gently and fades quickly, never rising high enough to travel across the entire hall. It feels a little like watching distant stars shift slowly across the night sky. Each movement is small. Each movement is quiet. Yet together, they create a pattern that helps everyone find their place. No one points to the pattern, no one names it, and still it guides the evening. You rest your hands again along the edge of the bench, feeling the familiar smoothness beneath your fingers. The wood carries traces of many other evenings like this one, when others learned the same lesson you are learning now. Inside a castle hall, the body speaks even when the voice remains silent. And sometimes, the safest language of all is simply to remain still. When the meal ends, the hall does not empty all at once. Instead, people leave in small groups, rising from benches with the same care they used when sitting down. Cups are returned. Sleeves settle back into place. Voices soften as they move toward the edges of the room. The fire continues to glow at the center of the hall, but its warmth no longer gathers everyone together. Night changes the castle. During the day, movement through corridors feels ordinary enough. Servants carry baskets. Messengers pass through doorways. Visitors arrive beneath archways that seem almost welcoming in the light. But after dark, the same corridors become something else, more watchful, more deliberate. You step beyond the hall slowly, following the line of the wall where torchlight rests in iron brackets. Each flame moves gently, casting long shadows that stretch across the stone like quiet reminders that the castle is still awake, even when voices have faded. In medieval households, nighttime movement was rarely casual. Studies by historians such as Joseph and Francis Guise suggest that access to inner spaces depended strongly on rank and purpose, especially once evening routines had begun. Corridors were not closed exactly, but they were no longer neutral places. They began to ask questions. Where are you going? Who expects you? Why now? A narrow passage leads toward a stair that curves upward into darkness. You pause before reaching it, noticing that no one else is climbing. Instead, most people move along the lower level, toward sleeping spaces assigned earlier in the day. Sleeping arrangements inside castles followed their own quiet order. The lord and his family rested in private chambers. Trusted attendants slept nearby. Others found places along outer rooms or shared sleeping spaces arranged according to household responsibility. These arrangements were not simply practical. They were signals of belonging. Farther ahead, a gate porter appears at the end of the corridor. He carries a small lantern whose light moves gently with each step. One by one, he checks the doors along the passage, closing some fully and leaving others slightly open. And he is not locking the castle against enemies. He is arranging the night. In many castles, porters and watchmen maintain the rhythm of evening movement by confirming which doors should remain accessible and which should rest closed until morning. Their work helped preserve both safety and structure inside the household. When he reaches the stair you had been considering, the porter pauses and rests his hand against the wooden rail. He does not forbid you to climb. He simply remains there long enough that the stair begins to feel less inviting. You understand. Certain places belong to the night only for certain people. Ian Mortimer describes medieval residences as spaces where proximity to private chambers reflected trust as much as comfort. And to approach those areas without invitation could suggest uncertainty about one's position in the household. So most people do not try. Instead, they choose the corridors that remain quietly open. You follow one of these safer paths now, listening to the sound of your own footsteps against the stone floor. The sound travels farther than expected, echoing gently along the passage before fading again. At night, even footsteps speak more clearly. Somewhere nearby, a door closes with a soft wooden sound. Another opens briefly, releasing a thin ribbon of candlelight before returning to darkness. No one hurries. No one lingers unnecessarily. Movement itself has become a language. In aristocratic tradition, hospitality carried strong expectations after sunset as well as during the day. A guest who wandered too freely risked appearing uncertain of their welcome. A servant who moved without purpose risked appearing inattentive to duty. Even a messenger walked carefully once evening routines had begun. The castle did not become silent at night. It became precise. The porter finishes his round and turns back along the corridor, lantern light swaying gently beside him. For a moment, the shadows along the wall shift again as he passes the iron torch bracket near you. The flame flickers once, then steadies. You remain where you are. It feels like the right choice, because inside these walls, survival often depends not on knowing where you are allowed to go, but on recognizing when stillness is the wiser path. Somewhere above you, footsteps cross a wooden floor. Somewhere below, a distant door closes again. The castle continues breathing around you, even as the night deepens. And you begin to understand something that no one needed to explain aloud. Inside a medieval castle, safety is rarely loud. It is quiet. It is patient. And very often, it is simply a matter of knowing when not to move at all. Far from stone corridors and torchlit stairways, another kind of careful movement is taking place. It happens inside a workshop where the air smells faintly of resin and warm wood, and where windows are opened just enough to let daylight fall across narrow benches covered with tools that look both simple and precise at the same time. Here, no one is arranging seating. No one is measuring rank. Instead, people are listening. Long before the violin became familiar in concert halls and orchestras, the musicians already knew instruments that could sing when touched by a bow. One of these was called the rebec, a small curved instrument with a narrow body and a voice that carried easily across open courtyards and narrow streets. Another was the vielle, slightly broader in shape, capable of longer tones that followed dancers through village gatherings and court celebrations alike. These earlier instruments did not yet sound like the violin you may be imagining now. Their voices were softer in some places and sharper in others, a little like young animals learning how to call across a wide field before discovering how far their voices can travel. Still, they mattered. They taught musicians something important. That sound could be stretched, that melody could be held longer than a breath, and that a single line of music could move through space without disappearing too quickly. Inside the workshop, a young apprentice is warming a thin strip of maple above a small charcoal brazier. He does not rush. The wood must bend slowly or it will crack. He holds it carefully against a curved mold, pressing gently until the shape begins to settle into place. He is not making music yet. He is preparing its container. Across northern Italy, especially in towns where trade routes crossed rivers and markets gathered travelers from different regions, instrument makers were already experimenting with ways to improve the shape and strength of bowed instruments. Workshops passed knowledge from one generation to the next, not through written instructions, but through repeated gestures like the one you are watching now. Heat, pressure, patience, and these were the first teachers. On another bench nearby rests a bow strung with pale strands of horsehair. The apprentice lifts it carefully and turns a small screw at the end until the strands tighten slightly. Not too tight, just enough to give them tension. Even this small adjustment changes the sound that will eventually emerge. Horsehair has been used for bows for many centuries because its surface catches the string in a gentle grip, allowing vibration to continue longer than a finger alone could manage. When the bow moves across the string, the sound does not stop immediately. It continues, as though the instrument itself has learned how to breathe more slowly. This was the beginning of something new, Earlier instruments had already shown what was possible. But makers in these workshops were beginning to imagine something more balanced, something clearer, something that could travel not only across a room, but across a gathering of many instruments at once. The apprentice places the bow back on the bench and turns toward another piece of wood resting nearby. This one is lighter in color, thinner, and shaped differently from the curved maple ribs he has just bent. It will become the top of the instrument. Makers often chose spruce for this part because its fibers carried vibration easily. Maple formed the back and sides because it reflected sound inward again. Together, the two woods created a small chamber where tone could gather before leaving the instrument in a steady stream. No one in the workshop explains this with diagrams or measurements written on paper. They learn it by listening, by tapping the wood lightly, by holding it close to the ear, by noticing how long the vibration remains after the touch has ended. Across Europe during these centuries, music itself was changing quietly. Voices still led many performances, especially in churches and courts. But instruments were beginning to stand beside them rather than behind them. Players wanted sounds that could match the human voice not only in pitch, but in expression. An instrument that could whisper. An instrument that could brighten. An instrument that could linger. The shapes forming in this small workshop were moving slowly toward that possibility. The apprentice finishes bending the strip of maple and places it carefully alongside others that are already cooling into their curved forms. When they are joined together, they will outline a body unlike the rebec and unlike the vielle, something more symmetrical, more balanced, and more prepared for a wider range of sound. He does not yet know how important this work will become. He only knows that each curve must match the next one. Each surface must remain smooth. Each piece must listen to the others before they can be joined together. Instruments, like households, depend on balance. And sometimes balance takes many years before it can be heard clearly. The workshop has not changed very much since you last looked around. The same benches stand in the same places. The same tools rest where they were left. The apprentice is still sweeping the thin curls of maple that gathered beneath the work table while ribs were shaped over gentle heat. And yet, something new has begun to draw your attention. On the wall above the bench hangs a wooden form, smooth at the edges, shaped with careful symmetry. It looks modest, almost ordinary. But this mold is doing something important. It is teaching the instrument how to remain itself. Before makers began using molds like this one, bowed instruments often varied from one example to the next. Some were narrow, some were wider. Some carried their sound unevenly from one side to the other. But here in the northern Italian town of Cremona, a family of instrument makers began shaping their work with new consistency. Their name was Amati. Andrea Amati, working during the middle years of the 16th century, helped establish a pattern for violin construction that allowed each instrument to balance its parts more reliably. The curves became steadier, the body proportions became more predictable, and the sound that emerged from these instruments began to travel with greater clarity across larger spaces. He did not change everything at once. He adjusted gradually, one curve at a time, one thickness at a time, one listening test after another. The apprentice pauses his sweeping and glances toward the mold hanging above him. He has seen it many times before, but today he studies it more carefully. Perhaps he is beginning to understand that this simple shape is not only a guide for wood, it is a guide for sound. In Cremona, instrument making was rarely the work of one person alone. Knowledge moved through families and workshops like a quiet inheritance. Skills passed from older hands to younger ones through repetition rather than instruction. A gesture shown once could remain useful for a lifetime. In this way, Instruments slowly became more alike in structure while becoming more individual in voice. Years later, another maker in the same town would continue this work with unusual patience. His name was Antonio Stradivari. He studied the instruments that came before him and began refining them further, adjusting the arch of the top plate, the thickness of the wood, and the placement of the openings through which sound escaped the body. These openings, shaped like slender curves facing one another, allowed the instrument's voice to move outward more freely. The result was not louder sound alone. It was clearer sound, a tone that could cross a crowded room without losing its brightness. Players noticed the difference quickly. So did listeners. The apprentice returns his broom to the corner and lifts a newly shaped piece of maple from the bench. He turns it slowly in his hands, feeling the smooth surface where tools have passed again and again. Somewhere in this curve is a decision made by someone he has never met, someone whose work continues through his own. Later still, another Cremona maker named Giuseppe Guarneri would shape instruments with a slightly different character. His violins often carried a darker tone, fuller and deeper, as though the sound had gathered more weight before leaving the wood. Musicians who played these instruments sometimes described them as voices that could remain strong, even in large halls filled with many players at once. Different hands, different choices, different sounds, yet all connected by the same quiet workshop traditions. The mold on the wall remains where it has always been. It does not change shape. It does not move. But around it, generations of makers continue adjusting small details that listeners will not see, but will certainly hear. The apprentice runs his fingers along the edge of the maple piece once more, before placing it beside the others, waiting to be joined together. Outside the window, the afternoon light has shifted slightly, falling now across the workbench at a lower angle than before. Time is moving. So is knowledge. Historians who study the Cremona workshops often describe them not simply as places where instruments were made, but as places where sound itself was gradually refined. Each maker listened to the work of those who came earlier, then adjusted something small before passing the result forward again. A curve softened, a plate thinned slightly, an opening widened just enough to let the tone travel more freely. No single change transformed the violin all at once. Instead, improvement arrived slowly, like stars appearing one by one in the evening sky, until a pattern finally becomes visible. The apprentice lifts his broom again and gathers the last of the maple curls into a small pile near the door. They are light enough to move with the smallest breath of air. Yet each one is a trace of the instrument that will soon begin to speak. He may not yet know where that sound will travel. Perhaps into a church, perhaps into a court, perhaps into a room filled with listeners who have never seen this workshop at all. But the shape hanging quietly on the wall already understands something he is only beginning to learn, and sound can travel farther than the hands that first shaped it. The violin does not leave the workshop all at once. It travels slowly, first into nearby rooms where small groups gather, then into churches where sound lingers longer beneath high ceilings, and eventually into courts where musicians begin listening to one another more carefully than before. At the beginning, the violin is only one voice among several. Earlier bowed instruments, often called the viol family, still stand beside it. These instruments are shaped differently, with flatter shoulders and softer tones that settle gently into shared music rather than rising above it. For many years, they remain familiar companions in courts and chambers. But something about the violin begins to change the balance. Its sound travels farther. Its tone remains clear even when other instruments are playing. And its shape allows players to move more freely along the strings, shaping melodies that feel closer to the human voice. Inside a church, not far from where the workshops stand, a musician lifts his violin and turns slightly toward the others gathered beside him. Candles burn steadily along the walls. Music stands form a loose semicircle near the front of the room. Each player adjusts their position just enough to see the leader's bow. This arrangement is still new. Earlier ensembles often followed voices rather than instruments. But now the violin is beginning to guide entrances, pauses, and changes of tempo with quiet confidence. The musician draws his bow gently across the strings to check their tuning. The sound rises, settles, and then rises again as he adjusts each string until it matches the others. He listens carefully. So do the players around him. Arcangelo Corelli, a violinist and composer working in the later years of the 17th century, helped shape this new role for the instrument. In his music, the violin often stood at the front of the ensemble, guiding the direction of the performance while still remaining part of the group rather than separate from it. This balance mattered. The violin was not meant to replace the others. It was meant to connect them. Soon after, another composer working in Venice began exploring how far this connection could reach. Antonio Vivaldi wrote music in which one violin stepped forward briefly, speaking alone before returning again to the company of the ensemble. Listeners began to notice the effect immediately. It felt like a conversation. One voice speaking, many voices answering. Then the first voice returning again with something new to say. Over time, this pattern became one of the most recognizable ways instruments could share music together. The violin did not simply blend anymore. It moved forward and back, leading and listening at the same time. In the church, the musician lowers his bow for a moment and adjusts the position of his stand. Around him, other players shift their chairs slightly, aligning themselves more clearly with his movements. The room is learning how to listen differently. Historians who study early orchestras often describe this period as a slow reorganization of musical space. Instead of many equal instruments sharing a melody together, ensembles began arranging themselves so that one voice could guide the others when needed. The violin proved especially suited to this role. It could sing clearly without becoming overwhelming. It could move quickly without losing warmth. It could rise above the group and then return again without disturbing the balance of sound. Across Europe, players gradually began choosing violins more often than the older viol instruments for leading positions. This change did not happen suddenly. For many years, both families of instruments continued to appear together in performances. But listeners were already noticing the difference. The violin carried energy more easily through large rooms. It answered voices more naturally. It shaped musical lines that could stretch across longer passages without fading. The church musician lifts his bow again, and then this time, the others follow him without hesitation. Their sound begins together, spreading outward through the hall in a steady flow that feels both organized and alive at the same time. Each instrument contributes something distinct, yet the violin shows them when to begin, when to pause, when to return. The arrangement of chairs and stands now looks less like a gathering and more like a shared table where each voice has its place. Some provide depth, some provide brightness, some carry rhythm gently beneath the surface, and the violin helps hold them together. No announcement marks this change. No single performance completes it. Instead, the instrument gradually becomes something musicians trust to guide them. Inside churches, courts, and chambers, the violin is learning not only how to speak clearly, it is learning how to lead. At first, the violin only needed to be clear. Then it needed to be strong enough to guide other instruments. Now it begins learning something more delicate. It begins learning how to change its voice. Inside a quiet room near the edge of a small European town, a traveling violinist stands beside an open window. The evening air has cooled slightly, and he notices the difference immediately. His fingers move along the strings, adjusting them gently before lifting the bow again. The sound that follows is not the same as before. It is softer now, more flexible. Strings made from carefully prepared animal gut respond quickly to changes in air and temperature. When the air grows cooler or more humid, their tension shifts slightly. Players have always known this. They adjust instinctively, listening for the moment when the instrument begins to settle again. The violinist tilts his head as he plays a longer note. He is not correcting a mistake. He is shaping a voice. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, musicians were beginning to explore just how expressive this instrument could become. They discovered that the violin could move between brightness and shadow with surprising ease, sometimes within a single phrase. Listeners noticed something new in these sounds. They felt familiar, almost like speech. One performer in particular became famous for showing how far the violin could travel in this direction. His name was Niccolò Paganini. Audiences described his playing as unusually fluid, as though the instrument were speaking rather than sounding. Some even believed his performances were mysterious in origin. But much of what listeners heard came from careful attention to movement. Paganini explored ways of shifting the left hand quickly along the fingerboard, allowing tones to rise and fall without interruption. He used lighter touches of the bow to create sounds that seemed to hover briefly before continuing forward again. These techniques did not change the instrument itself. They changed what people believed it could do. Elsewhere in Europe, composers were beginning to imagine the violin differently as well. Ludwig van Beethoven wrote music in which string instruments carried long emotional lines that unfolded gradually rather than quickly. Instead of decorating melodies already present, violins began shaping the direction of the music itself. In chamber performances, honest listeners sometimes noticed that the violin did not simply accompany the piano or the cello. It answered them. It questioned them. It continued thoughts they had already begun. The traveling violinist beside the window adjusts his bow once more and begins another passage. This time the tone deepens slightly as his fingers press more firmly into the string. The change is small, but it alters the mood of the room immediately. Johannes Brahms, writing later in the 19th century, continued exploring this quieter strength of the violin. In his music, the instrument often carried reflective lines that seemed to unfold slowly, like conversations remembered rather than spoken for the first time. Players discovered that listeners responded differently to these sounds. They listened longer, more carefully, not as though the instrument were telling them something personal. Outside the window, the evening air shifts again, and the violinist pauses to adjust one string slightly before continuing. These small adjustments are part of the instrument's nature. Unlike later metal strings, gut strings respond quickly to their surroundings, asking the player to remain attentive throughout the performance. This attention becomes part of the music itself. Historians of performance practice often note that the violin's expressive power did not come from a single invention or technique. It grew slowly through generations of players learning how to guide sound with greater sensitivity. A softer bow, a slower movement of the fingers, a longer breath between phrases. Each change added something new. Over time, listeners began to recognize the violin not only as an instrument that could lead ensembles, but as one that could reflect feeling with unusual closeness. Its tone could brighten like morning light or darken like a cloud passing across the sun, sometimes within the same line of music. The traveling violinist lowers his bow at last and listens to the final vibration fade into the evening air. For a moment, The room remains quiet, not empty, just listening. He rests the instrument against his shoulder a little longer before placing it carefully into its case. Perhaps he knows that wherever he travels next, the violin will carry its voice with him into another room, another gathering, another evening like this one. And by now, that voice has become something listeners recognize almost as a companion. You arrive not through a gate, but along a shoreline. The island rises gradually from the water, its slopes pale beneath the morning light. Boats rest in the harbor with their hulls touching the edge of the sea as gently as cups placed beside a table. There are voices here, and movement, and the steady rhythm of unloading cargo that has crossed long distances before reaching this place. No one seems surprised that you have arrived by water. Here, this is the ordinary way to approach a center of power. Ahead of you, the palace stands without high defensive walls. Its passages turn inward and outward at once, opening toward courtyards where sunlight settles easily across painted surfaces. For many years, archaeologists have noticed this unusual feature. Unlike later fortified cities on the mainland, these palace centers do not seem designed primarily for protection against attack. Instead, they appear designed for gathering, for storing, for organizing movement. This changes the feeling of arrival. You are not entering a fortress. You are entering a place where goods, messages, and people come and go in steady rhythm with the sea. Near the harbor, a worker lifts a heavy clay jar from the deck of a narrow trading vessel. He adjusts it carefully against his shoulder before stepping onto the stone path leading inland. The jar is taller than his knee and wide enough that both arms must support it as he walks. Inside, there may be olive oil, or grain, or wine brought from another coast. He does not open it. He already knows where it belongs. The path leads him toward a long corridor inside the palace complex, where many similar jars are standing in quiet rows. These tall containers are called pithoi. Their surfaces are rough beneath the hand, shaped to hold large quantities of goods that can be stored safely through changing seasons. When you step into the corridor, the air feels cooler immediately. The jars rise around you like patient companions, each one holding part of the island's daily rhythm inside it. Historians sometimes describe the Minoan palace system as a storage and sharing network rather than a center of royal command alone. Goods arrived from surrounding farms and distant ports. They were recorded, arranged, and redistributed again according to need. The palace did not only receive, it returned. Like a carefully prepared table where food arrives from many kitchens and is then shared outward again. The system depended on balance rather than accumulation. The harbor worker places his jar beside the others and steps back for a moment before leaving the corridor. He does not linger. Another jar is already waiting near the shoreline. Outside, the sea continues its quiet work. Ships arrive carrying copper from distant mountains, cloth from neighboring islands, painted pottery from mainland workshops. In return, ships leave again with oil, saffron, crafted goods, and stories that travel farther than the jars themselves. The palace remains open to all of this movement. You walk farther into the central court now, noticing how light falls across the stone floor without interruption from defensive towers or narrow gateways. People cross the space freely, carrying baskets, tools, and folded cloth. No one appears hurried. Movement here feels expected, even welcome. Archaeological discoveries suggest that these palace centers functioned as administrative and ceremonial gathering places rather than military strongholds. Their position near coastlines allowed them to guide trade across the eastern Mediterranean, connecting the island to Egypt in the south and to Anatolia in the east. as well as to mainland Greece in the north. The sea was not a boundary. It was a road. You paused near the edge of the court where another row of pithoi stands partly in shadow. Their curved sides carry faint marks left by the hands that shaped them long ago. Some are decorated with simple ridges that help strengthen their walls. Others remain smooth, their surfaces worn by years of quiet contact. Each one holds something necessary. Each one belongs somewhere in the wider pattern of exchange that keeps the palace alive. The harbor worker passes through the court again, already returning toward the shoreline. He walks more lightly now that his arms are free. Soon he will lift another jar and begin the journey once more. This movement does not end. It repeats, day after day, season after season. Standing here, you begin to understand that safety in this place does not come from walls or watchtowers. It comes from connection, from ships that continue arriving, from goods that continue moving, from people who know where each object belongs before it even touches the ground. The palace breathes with the sea, and the sea, in return, keeps the palace alive. As you cross the central court again, you begin to notice something that did not seem important at first. Images repeat themselves. Not exactly the same each time, but close enough that they feel familiar before you even recognize why. Along one wall, a painted figure leans forward in motion beside the curved back of a bull. The animal's body stretches across the plaster surface in a long, flowing shape that seems almost alive in the sunlight. Its legs extend as though it is still running somewhere beyond the wall itself. Nearby, another image shows a similar movement again, and then another. It becomes clear that this is not decoration placed at random. It is a language. Inside the palace, a young painter kneels beside a shallow stone bowl filled with crushed mineral powder. He adds a small amount of water and begins mixing slowly with a smooth stick until the color thickens into a deep red paste. When the plaster wall beside him is still slightly damp, he lifts the pigment and begins pressing it carefully into the surface. This is how the color stays for centuries. It becomes part of the wall itself. Archaeologists studying these frescoes often note how frequently bulls appear in Minoan imagery. Sometimes they stand calmly. Sometimes they move in long, sweeping lines. Sometimes human figures appear beside them, turning or leaping in ways that suggest motion rather than struggle. The meaning of these scenes is still discussed today. But one thing is clear. They were important enough to repeat again and again. Across another passage, you notice a different shape appearing on carved stones and small objects placed carefully within rooms. It looks simple at first, almost like a tool used for splitting wood. Yet its form returns so often that it begins to feel deliberate. It has two blades instead of one. This object is often called a double axe. Modern historians use the name labris to describe it, borrowing a later word that helps identify its shape. In the palace spaces of Crete, this symbol appears in places that suggest ceremony rather than labor. It is carved into stone blocks. It is painted beside doorways. It is placed where movement slows rather than where work begins. Like the images of bulls, it forms part of a repeated pattern. The painter lifts another brush of color and traces a curved line along the wall beside him. He pauses often, not because he is uncertain, but because the shape must follow the surface exactly as it settles into place. Each movement is measured. Each line connects to the next one before it. Watching him work, you begin to understand there's something about these images. They are not meant to stand alone. They belong together. Craft historians sometimes describe symbols like these as threads stitched repeatedly into a familiar cloth. One appearance might pass unnoticed, but many appearances together begin to create a pattern strong enough to guide memory across generations. As you continue walking through the palace corridors, another detail becomes visible. Many of the painted figures moving through these scenes are women. They appear standing in ceremonial spaces. They appear carrying vessels, and they appear participating in movement that looks rhythmic rather than hurried. Their clothing is carefully shaped. Their posture is upright and confident. Their presence is not hidden behind walls or placed at the edges of the image. Instead, they stand near the center of it. This has led many historians to suggest that women may have played visible roles in ritual activity within Minoan society. The images do not explain everything, but they show participation rather than absence. The painter finishes his work for the moment and steps back from the wall. The red curve he has placed beside the bull's movement now connects with another shape already waiting there. Together, they form part of a larger scene that will only become complete when the next section is added. He cleans his brush slowly in a small bowl of water and sets it beside the pigment stone. Nothing here feels rushed. Even belief seems to move at a measured pace. Unlike later temples where rituals gathered inside enclosed spaces, Minoan ceremonial life appears to have been woven through courtyards, stairways, and painted halls that remained open to light and movement. The palace itself becomes part of the ritual landscape. You begin to see why the symbols appear in so many places. They are reminders, not commands. They guide attention rather than demand it. A carved double axe stands beside a doorway leading toward another passage. Its shape catches the sunlight briefly as you pass. For a moment, it seems less like a tool and more like a marker placed quietly along a path that many people have followed before you. And somewhere nearby, and beyond the painted walls and storage rooms filled with clay jars, another kind of record is waiting. One that no one has yet learned how to read. Beyond the painted walls and long storage passages, you begin to notice another kind of object resting quietly in corners of the palace. At first, it looks unimportant. A small rectangle of clay, flat on one side, pressed with narrow lines on the other. But once you see one, you begin to see many. Some are stacked beside doorways. Others rest along shelves near storage rooms where jars of oil and grain stand in careful rows. A few lie close to work areas where goods arrive from the harbor before being carried deeper into the palace corridors. Each tablet carries marks, rows of signs pressed into the clay while it was still soft. These marks form a writing system that scholars today call Linear A. No one living now can read it with certainty, and yet the tablets remain. Near one doorway, a palace record keeper kneels beside a low shelf where several tablets have been placed in the sunlight. He lifts one carefully between both hands, checking whether its surface has hardened enough to be stacked with the others. The clay is still slightly warm from the morning light. He turns it once, then places it gently on top of another. He already knows what the signs mean. He does not need to read them aloud. They guide his work as surely as spoken instructions. In palace societies like this one, writing often served practical purposes before anything else. Goods arriving from farms and harbors needed to be counted. Storage rooms needed to be organized. Auto deliveries needed to be remembered even after the people who carried them had left. The tablets helped with this quiet coordination. Some show repeated signs that scholars believe may represent numbers or quantities. Others appear beside simple drawings that might indicate containers or materials. Still others include longer sequences whose meaning remains uncertain. Together, they suggest a system designed not for storytelling, but for keeping track of movement. Movement of grain, movement of oil, movement of cloth, movement of people. The record keeper lifts another tablet and presses it gently against the edge of the shelf to align it with the others. His fingers leave faint traces on the clay surface before he releases it. These marks will remain long after he has stepped away. You begin to understand that writing here is not meant to be admired. It is meant to be useful. Archaeologists studying these tablets have found them in storerooms, corridors, and administrative spaces across several palace centers on the island. Many appear to record deliveries and distributions connected with the storage system you noticed earlier among the tall jars. They are quiet companions to the pithoi. Both help organize the flow of daily life. Nearby, another tablet rests alone beside a doorway where sunlight reaches the floor. Its surface has dried unevenly, leaving small ridges where the clay settled before hardening. The signs pressed into it remain clear, though their meaning is still hidden from modern readers. On it feels a little like discovering footprints along a shoreline after the traveler has already disappeared beyond the horizon. The path is visible, but the destination is not. Centuries after these tablets were first made, a related writing system appeared in the same region. Scholars call it Linear B. Unlike the earlier script, Linear B has been carefully studied and is now understood to record an early form of the Greek language. Many of its signs resemble those used in Linear A, but not all. This suggests that later administrators adapted an earlier writing tradition rather than inventing a completely new one. The older script remained present beneath the newer one, like a familiar path still visible beneath fresh footsteps. The record keeper finishes stacking the last tablet and rises slowly from his place beside the shelf. He pauses for a moment to look across the corridor where rows of jars stand quietly in the dim light. Perhaps he is remembering the next delivery that will arrive. Perhaps he is already thinking about the next set of marks he will press into fresh clay later in the day. His work does not end when the tablets are stacked. It continues with the rhythm of the palace itself. Even though the signs he has written remain unread today, they still tell us something important. They show that this society depended on careful organization. They show that goods moved through these corridors in patterns that required memory and attention. They show that someone was always watching the flow of things. You remain near the doorway for a moment longer, looking at the tablet resting in the sunlight. Its surface has hardened now. The marks pressed into it will not change again. The meaning of those marks may still be hidden, but the care with which they were placed is not. And sometimes, even unread words can still leave traces of careful lives behind them. The harbor looks almost the same as before. Ships still rest near the shoreline, nets still dry along wooden frames. The path between water and palace still carries the familiar rhythm of footsteps, moving back and forth with jars balanced against careful shoulders. And yet, something has changed. At first, it is difficult to say exactly what. The horizon appears slightly paler than before, as though the morning light has settled differently across the surface of the sea. The air carries a faint dryness that does not belong entirely to the season. Even the sound of the waves feels softer, as though traveling a longer distance before reaching the shore. The harbor worker you saw earlier steps once again toward the edge of the water. He pauses before lifting his next jar. Something unusual is drifting near the shoreline. Small pale stones float lightly among the waves. They do not sink like ordinary rock. Instead, they move gently with the surface of the sea, turning slowly as they approach the sand. He bends to lift one. It is lighter than expected, porous beneath the fingers. These floating fragments are pieces of pumice, carried across the water from an island far to the north, where a powerful volcanic eruption has recently reshaped the land itself. Modern researchers studying coastlines around Crete have found traces suggesting that materials like these traveled long distances after the eruption on Thera, the island now called Santorini. But here, in this moment, the harbor worker does not know the source. He only knows that the sea has brought something unfamiliar. He sets the stone aside and continues his work. There are still jars to carry. Deliveries must still reach the palace corridors before the day grows warmer. Yet the sea continues sending quiet signs. Over time, waves arrive, carrying more pale fragments. Shorelines change slightly as currents shift. Some harbors become less predictable than before. Trade routes that once followed steady patterns begin requiring new adjustments. None of this happens suddenly. The palace still stands. The storage rooms remain filled. The painted walls still catch the light of the afternoon sun just as they always have. But movement has begun to change. Archaeologists studying coastal settlements across northern Crete have discovered evidence suggesting that sea disturbances followed the eruption on Thera. Layers of unusual deposits appear in places where waves once moved differently. Harbors that supported regular travel may have required new routes or new timing after these changes. Trade depends on rhythm, and rhythm depends on predictability. When the sea shifts, the rhythm shifts with it. The harbor worker lifts another jar and carries it inland as he has done many times before. Yet fewer ships are waiting today. The distance between their arrivals has grown slightly longer. The path to the palace still feels familiar, but quieter. Inside the storage corridor, rows of pithoi continue standing in careful order. The palace record keeper still presses signs into fresh clay tablets. The painter still prepares pigments beside damp plaster walls. Life continues. But slowly, other changes begin appearing as well. Visitors arrive whose clothing differs slightly from those who usually walk these corridors. Their speech carries a different rhythm. Their methods of recording goods begin to resemble the writing system that scholars later call Linear B, rather than the earlier script used here for generations. These newcomers do not replace everything at once. They adjust. They reorganize. They continue using the same storage rooms, the same jars, the same courtyards filled with light. Archaeological evidence suggests that mainland administrators gradually became involved in palace organization after this period of environmental change. Yet many local traditions remained present long afterward. Religious symbols continued appearing. Artistic styles continued shaping painted surfaces. Daily routines continued guiding movement through familiar corridors. Civilizations do not vanish like footprints washed away by a single wave. They change direction more slowly than that. The harbor worker returns once more to the shoreline as evening approaches. The floating pumice has gathered in small clusters near the edge of the water now, moving gently with each incoming tide. He watches them for a moment before turning back toward the path that leads inland. There is still work to do tomorrow. There will be jars to carry again. But the sea has already begun telling a different story. And far beyond this shoreline, in lands connected by roads rather than waves, another traveler will one day move between courts, carrying something lighter than cargo and more lasting than stone. He will carry music. The road is longer than expected. It curves through forests where morning mist lingers low among the trees, then opens into towns where carriage wheels echo against stone streets before continuing again toward another palace waiting beyond the horizon. Inside the carriage sits a child who already knows what many adults spend years learning. He knows how to listen carefully. He knows how to remember music after hearing it only once. And he knows that each new destination may bring both welcome and uncertainty together. His name is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, But for now, he is simply a traveling boy with a small keyboard instrument resting beside him, wrapped carefully in cloth so that changes in air and weather do not disturb its tuning too much before the next performance. The instrument is light enough to carry from one hall to another. Yet what it holds is not light at all. It carries expectation. Across 18th century Europe, courts often invited young performers to demonstrate unusual musical ability. These visits were not only entertainment, they were opportunities for rulers and noble households to show their refinement and learning through the guests they welcomed. Music became a form of conversation between courts, and the child inside the carriage was part of that conversation. His father, Leopold Mozart, he sits nearby with a folded notebook resting across his lap. He watches the road ahead carefully, but he's also watching something else. Possibility. Leopold understood that talent alone was rarely enough. Introductions had to be arranged. Letters had to be delivered. Invitations had to be accepted at exactly the right moment. So the journey continued from court to court, city to city, each visit adding another small thread to a growing network of recognition. When the carriage stops at last before a palace entrance, servants step forward to guide the travelers inside. The corridors feel familiar even when the building itself is new. Candlelight settles along polished floors. Doors open toward rooms already prepared for visitors expected earlier in the day. Inside one such chamber, a copyist sits beside a narrow table covered with sheets of paper, waiting to be filled with notes. He has been working since evening, carefully copying music that the child will play the following morning. Each page must remain clear enough to read quickly under candlelight. Each line must match the next exactly. Ink dries slowly in the quiet air of the room, leaving faint reflections where the surface catches the flame beside him. He does not perform the music himself, but without his work, the performance cannot begin. This quiet preparation forms part of the same journey as the carriage road outside. The next morning arrives gently. Guests gather. Chairs are arranged closer to the instrument. The young musician takes his place at the keyboard, his feet not yet long enough to rest comfortably where older players might place theirs. Yet his hands move with steady confidence across the keys, shaping melodies that listeners recognize immediately as something unusual. Not louder, not faster, just clearer. Court audiences often listened closely during such performances. They did not only admire skill, they considered what the performance revealed about discipline, memory, and promise. A successful appearance could lead to another invitation in another city, or another country entirely. Approval traveled as quickly as the road allowed. But it did not always remain where it first appeared. Like sunlight passing across a courtyard wall, admiration could warm a visitor one day and fade quietly the next if attention moved elsewhere. So each performance carried its own importance. Even when the music itself felt familiar, the copyist finishes his work and places the final sheet carefully beside the others before stepping away from the table. His task is complete for now. Outside, the sound of carriage wheels returns again as another arrival reaches the palace entrance. Movement never truly stops in places like this. For the young musician, childhood unfolds not in a single home, but across many halls connected by travel, expectation, and careful listening. Each performance becomes part of a larger path that is still forming beneath his feet. He learns early that music opens doors, but he is also beginning to learn that doors can close as quietly as they open. And as the years pass, the same courts that once welcomed him with curiosity will begin expecting something more difficult to provide than talent alone. The journey between courts becomes shorter as the young musician grows older. Not because the distances change, but because expectations do. In the city of Salzburg, where cathedral towers rise above narrow streets that echo with bells at regular hours each day, employment within a court household offers something that travel cannot. Stability, regular duties, predictable income. For many musicians in the 18th century, such positions formed the foundation of their lives. A court appointment meant writing music for ceremonies, rehearsing with local ensembles, and performing when required by the household calendar. The work was steady, the responsibilities were clear, and the structure was strong. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart accepted such employment under Archbishop Hieronymus Colloredo, whose court required music for religious services as well as official gatherings. The arrangement provided opportunity, but it also defined limits. Music needed to serve occasions already planned. Rehearsals followed schedules already set. Travel required permission before it could begin. At first, these expectations seemed manageable. They even felt familiar. Yet, gradually, something changed. Mozart had already spent many years moving between courts where audiences listened closely for something new each time he performed. Returning to a single location brought comfort, but also constraint. The rhythms of court employment allowed less room for the kind of exploration he had begun to imagine. He continued writing carefully, continued performing reliably, but he also began listening for another path. Inside a modest room in Salzburg, he folds a letter slowly before placing it beside a small writing table. Outside the window, evening light settles across the rooftops, softening the outlines of the city beyond. The letter carries a request: permission to travel again, permission to seek new audiences, permission to shape his work more freely than the court calendar allowed. Such requests did not always receive immediate approval. Court musicians served households, not themselves. Over time, disagreements between Mozart and Archbishop Colloredo became more difficult to ignore. The expectations of service remained clear, but Mozart's desire for independence grew stronger. Eventually, he chose to leave the position entirely. This decision changed everything. Without court employment, income no longer arrived at regular intervals. Invitations had to be arranged carefully. Performances depended on reputation rather than obligation. Payment sometimes arrived later than expected, sometimes much later. In the city of Vienna, where wide streets carried carriage wheels past theaters and coffee houses filled with conversation about music and politics alike, Mozart began building a new kind of working life. Instead of serving a single household, he offered lessons, organized performances, and composed pieces for publication and private patrons. The freedom was real. So was the uncertainty. One evening, a Vienna landlord stands quietly in the doorway of Mozart's lodging, holding his hat respectfully in both hands. He does not speak immediately. He waits until the composer finishes writing the last line of a letter before clearing his throat gently. Payment is expected. Not urgently, but soon. Mozart nods with quiet understanding. Letters requesting assistance from patrons already rest on the table beside him, their folded edges showing where they have been opened and closed more than once, while waiting for replies. This uncertainty becomes part of daily life. Yet something else becomes possible at the same time. Without the fixed schedule of court service, Mozart begins composing more freely than before. He writes music for public concerts, private gatherings, and students eager to learn new works that reflect changing tastes in Vienna's musical circles. Each piece becomes part of a conversation with listeners rather than a response to instruction alone. Historians studying this period often describe Mozart's Vienna years as a turning point in the life of the independent composer. Instead of belonging to a single household, he moved between many audiences whose expectations shifted from season to season. The work required careful balance. Like retuning an instrument while already playing before listeners, independence demanded adjustment without interruption. Each decision shaped the next performance before the previous one had fully settled. The landlord closes the door quietly after receiving a promise that payment will arrive soon. The room returns to stillness again. Outside, carriage wheels pass along the street below, carrying other musicians toward other engagements that evening. Mozart remains at his table, continuing to write. Uncertainty has not slowed the music. If anything, it has widened the space in which new ideas can begin to gather, and before long, those ideas will allow several musical voices to speak together in ways listeners have not heard before. The rehearsal room is quieter than the performance hall. Chairs stand closer together here. Candles burn nearer the music stands. Voices repeat the same phrases more than once. Not because they are uncertain, but because something new is being built slowly between them. A young singer stands beside a narrow wooden stand, holding a page of music that has already been folded once and opened again. The edges of the paper carry faint marks where fingers have rested while waiting for the next entrance. Nearby, the orchestra prepares to begin again. In earlier generations of opera, music often allowed one character to speak clearly while others waited their turn. The story moved forward, step by step, voice by voice, like travelers crossing a narrow bridge one at a time. But now, something different is happening. The composer, seated near the front of the room, listens carefully as the singer repeats a short passage. Instead of asking her to wait for silence from the others, he allows several voices to continue at once. Each line carries its own feeling. Each voice moves at its own pace. And still the music remains clear. This approach appears often in operas such as The Marriage of Figaro and Don Giovanni, where characters share scenes without surrendering their individual thoughts. Instead of pausing for one another, they move together, creating moments where listeners can hear several emotions unfolding at the same time. Historians sometimes describe this as ensemble writing. But inside the rehearsal room, it feels more like conversation. The singer lifts her voice again as another performer joins from across the room. A third voice enters soon after. None of them replaces the others. Instead, they remain distinct, like clouds moving across the same sky in slightly different directions while still belonging to the same weather. The composer listens closely, not for volume, not for speed, but for balance. A sheet of manuscript paper rests beside his hand, its surface still reflecting the faint shine of recently placed ink. The notes written there guide the performers, yet they also respond to what he hears in the room. Sometimes a passage changes slightly between rehearsals. Sometimes a phrase grows longer. Sometimes it becomes quieter. Each adjustment helps the voices remain separate without drifting apart. Beyond the rehearsal hall, Mozart's keyboard concertos explore a similar idea. Instead of placing the piano against the orchestra as though the two were competing, he allows them to exchange ideas gently. The keyboard introduces a thought. The orchestra responds. Then the keyboard returns again with something new. Listeners often experience this as dialogue rather than display. The music does not hurry. It listens. In one such performance, the keyboard player pauses briefly after a phrase that seems complete. The orchestra continues softly beneath the silence, as though encouraging the next thought to arrive when it is ready. When the keyboard returns, the conversation resumes, without interruption. Moments like this begin changing how audiences understand instrumental music. Instead of hearing one line supported by many others, they begin hearing several lines sharing space together. This balance will later influence composers such as Ludwig van Beethoven, who listened carefully to Mozart's work while shaping his own musical language. Beethoven's early compositions reflect the same attention to conversation between instruments, though his voice will eventually travel in its own direction. Inside the rehearsal room, the young singer lowers her page for a moment and listens, while another performer completes a passage nearby. She is not waiting for her turn. She is listening for her place. The candles beside the stands flicker slightly as someone opens a door at the far end of the room. Air moves across the pages, lifting their corners before settling again. The ink on the manuscript continues drying slowly, fixing each note in place where it will remain long after the rehearsal ends. Mozart leans forward slightly and marks a small adjustment on the page before him. The change is modest. Perhaps only a few notes shift their position. Yet the balance between voices becomes clearer almost immediately when the passage is repeated. Music like this allows listeners to follow several feelings at once. Curiosity beside uncertainty, laughter beside hesitation, confidence beside doubt. Each voice continues its own path, yet all remain connected within the same moment. The singer lifts her page again and prepares to begin the passage once more. This time the entrance feels easier. The voices settle into place beside one another as though they have always belonged together. And somewhere within this careful balance, the composer has begun shaping a kind of music that can hold many emotions at once without losing its calm center. Before long, however, one final composition will remain waiting on his desk. Unfinished, yet still carrying the same quiet clarity forward into the years that follow. The room is quieter now than the rehearsal space you visited earlier. There are still sheets of music resting on the table, still a candle burning beside them, still the familiar sound of a pen touching paper from time to time as notes take shape along the page. But something about the rhythm of work has changed. Movements are slower. Pauses last longer. The composer seated at the table continues writing. Yet the effort required for each line has grown heavier than before. In the final year of his life, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart began work on a composition that would later be known simply as the Requiem. The request arrived through a messenger who did not explain clearly who had sent it. Instead, he carried instructions quietly and returned again after some time to ask whether progress had begun. Such commissions were not unusual. Patrons often preferred privacy when arranging musical works. Still, this one felt different. The music itself carried a tone that asked for careful attention from the very beginning. A requiem is a composition written for remembrance. Its purpose is not celebration alone, but reflection. The structure follows words that had been sung in memorial services across Europe for generations. Mozart already understood this tradition well. Yet, as he worked, the manuscript beside him remained incomplete longer than expected. Illness began making sustained writing more difficult. Days passed when only a few measures could be added before rest became necessary again. Even so, he continued returning to the desk, adjusting passages already written and adding new lines wherever strength allowed. Across the room, a copyist waits beside the table, where loose sheets of manuscript paper have been arranged carefully beneath a small weight to keep them from shifting in the evening air. He watches quietly, ready to prepare fair copies once each section is complete. For now, he waits. Some portions of the composition are already finished. Others remain outlined, but not fully written. Still others exist only as ideas waiting to be placed on the page. Historians studying this period note that the commission itself came from Count Franz von Walsegg, a nobleman who sometimes requested works anonymously before presenting them later as part of private memorial observances. At the time, however, Mozart did not know the identity of the patron with certainty. He only knew the music needed to continue. Outside the window, carriage wheels pass along the street below, as they always have. The city moves forward at its ordinary pace. Inside the room, the candle beside the manuscript burns steadily, casting a soft circle of light across the pages where ink has already begun to dry. Mozart reaches once more for the pen, adds another phrase, pauses again. Even unfinished, the music already carries the shape of something complete in spirit, if not yet in detail. After his death, the responsibility for finishing the composition passed to Franz Sauer-Süssmayr, a student who had worked closely enough with Mozart to understand how the remaining sections might continue. Using sketches and instructions left behind, he completed the final movements so that the work could be performed as intended. The copyist beside the table gathers several finished pages and arranges them into a careful stack. He does not yet know how widely this music will travel in the years ahead. For him, the task is simple. Keep the pages in order. Keep them safe. Keep them ready. Over time, listeners across Europe began hearing Mozart's compositions more often than they had during his lifetime. Performances continued in concert halls, churches, and private gatherings long after the composer himself was no longer present to guide them. The unfinished Requiem became part of that growing recognition. Music once written for a single commission began belonging to many listeners instead. The candle beside the manuscript burns lower now. Shadows gather softly along the edges of the room. The copyist finishes arranging the last of the pages and places the small weight carefully across the stack so that the evening air cannot disturb them. The final seam of the work has been stitched by other hands, yet the shape of the garment remains the same. Sometimes music continues traveling even after the journey of its maker has come gently to rest. And soon, the halls, workshops, shorelines, and quiet writing rooms you have visited will return once more, gathering together in a final moment of reflection. Now that the journey has slowed, you begin to notice how familiar everything feels. Not because the places are the same, but because the movements within them are. You remember the long wooden bench in the castle hall, where people sat carefully so their place would be understood before they spoke. Even there, survival depended less on strength than on attention. A small adjustment of posture could change how others saw you. A moment of silence could protect your place within the room. Across those benches moved a quiet kind of wisdom, and that wisdom did not disappear when you left the castle behind. It followed you into the workshop where maple shavings gathered in soft curls along the floor. There, another kind of patience shaped the world more slowly than conversation ever could. A maker warmed wood gently over charcoal heat, bending it without forcing it. The violin did not appear suddenly. It learned its shape over time. You watched hands repeat the same movements again and again until sound itself became steadier, clearer, more able to travel beyond the walls where it began. Even then, the story continued moving outward. You arrived beside the shoreline of an island where no defensive walls guarded the palace entrances. Instead, ships arrived carrying jars of oil, cloth, and copper. Storage corridors filled quietly with tall clay vessels. A record keeper pressed signs into wet clay so movement could be remembered after footsteps faded. The palace did not protect itself by closing its gates. It protected itself by remaining connected. Goods arrived, goods departed, and people learned to trust the rhythm of exchange more than the certainty of stone. Later still, but in a room lit by candlelight in Vienna, another kind of patience appeared again. Ink dried slowly across manuscript pages, while a composer listened for the balance between voices, that could speak together without losing their individuality. Even uncertainty became part of the work. Letters waited for replies. Rent waited for payment. Yet music continued moving forward anyway. Across each of these places, something gentle remained constant. People learned how to move carefully inside structures they did not entirely control. The bench servant adjusted seating so others would feel comfortable in their rank. The apprentice shaped wood so future players could guide sound more clearly. The harbor worker carried jars along a path he had walked many times before, even when the sea began changing its habits. The copyist arranged unfinished pages so music could continue traveling after its composer was gone. None of them expected their work to be remembered centuries later. Yet it was, not through monuments alone, but through patterns, through repetition, through attention. If you listen closely, you can almost hear these centuries continuing together, like a long musical chord that does not end when the first note fades. Each place you visited adds another tone to the sound. Stone corridors, workshop benches, sea wind across painted walls, candlelight resting on unfinished pages. They do not replace one another. They remain together. And somewhere within that shared sound, you begin to recognize something familiar about your own moment in time as well. People are still arranging rooms carefully before gatherings begin, still shaping materials slowly with practiced hands, still carrying goods across uncertain distances, still writing letters whose answers have not yet arrived. History does not stand far away from you. It walks beside you quietly. Perhaps that is why these older worlds feel calm rather than distant. Their people were not moving faster than you are. They were simply paying attention to different details while learning the same lesson again and again. How to belong inside changing circumstances. How to continue working even when outcomes remained uncertain. How to leave something steady behind for those who would arrive later. The wooden bench you touched earlier has already been worn smooth by many hands before yours. The violin mold hanging in the workshop guided instruments that still sing long after their makers rested. The pumice drifting toward the harbor shore reminded workers that even the sea can change direction without warning. And the unfinished manuscript resting beneath candlelight continued speaking even after the room itself fell silent. All of these moments remained connected, not loudly, but patiently, like a quiet room waiting with the door still open, just enough for you to step inside again whenever you wish. And so we've reached the end of tonight's wandering. Whether your eyes are still open or already drifting, thank you for keeping me company here among worn stones, warm embers, and the small brave rituals of ordinary people. If this brought you a little quiet, you're welcome to subscribe or share it with someone who might need a softer night. For now, rest well. You're safe, you're warm, and the past can keep watch.